How much clutter is too much on a Wargames table, and at what point do our well-intentioned gaming aids stop supporting play and start getting in the way of the spectacle we're trying to create? We spend hundreds of hours painting armies and building terrain to make our battlefields look as realistic as possible, yet many of us then cover those same tables with tokens, markers, cards and dice. So are these gaming aids an essential part of modern wargaming, or are they undermining one of the things we enjoy most about the hobby? Now, the idea for this video came directly from a comment left in one of my recent videos covering the 1812 retreat from Moscow, a Battle Chronicle Wargame, a narrative skirmish project I've been involved in, playtesting and publishing over the past couple of months. During some of those early playtests we had quite a lot going on visually. There were loot markers on the table, activation reminders, condition tokens, dice pools sitting next to units and various other bits and pieces that naturally appear when you're stress testing a rule set. It wasn't unusual, but it was noticeable, and one viewer in particular, Granddaddy Says 29, left a comment that I thought was worth referring to, thinking about for a moment. We spend a huge amount of time painting miniatures, building terrain, weathering vehicles and flocking bases, and carefully constructing scenes that are meant to evoke real battlefields. And when we finally get everything onto the table, part of the enjoyment is simply stepping back and looking at it. There's a moment before the dice start rolling where it almost feels like a diorama, and that visual impact is a big part of why many of us are in the hobby in the first place. Now, that tension between visual immersion and mechanical clarity isn't new. I touched on it last year in a video called Vanishing Ranks, where I explored casualty removal versus using tokens, dice or other forms of tracking damage on the tabletop. That discussion revealed something quite interesting, which is that players tend to have very strong preferences about how information should be represented. Some people want the battlefield to physically reflect casualties as figures are removed. Others prefer markers because they keep units visually intact for longer and reduce disruption on the table. What became clear is that there isn't a single correct answer, as always, but rather a series of compromises between aesthetics and practicality. And that brings us neatly back to tokens more broadly, because once you widen the lens beyond casualties alone, you realise that modern wargaming is absolutely full of them. Wound markers, activation tokens, command points, suppression counters, objective markers, hidden movement indicators, special ability trackers and so on. Some games use just a few, others seem to require what feels like a small stationary shot before you even deploy the first unit. And yet, despite how common they are, there's still a lingering discomfort among some players about what they do to the table visually. So the question becomes fairly simple on the surface, but surprisingly complicated underneath. Are tokens enhancing the game by making it easier to play, or are they undermining the very thing that many of us value most, which is the visual spectacle of historical miniatures on a battlefield? And when you break it down properly, tokens exist for one primary reason: they reduce cognitive load. Instead of players having to remember multiple overlapping states across multiple units, the information is placed directly onto a physical space of your game. You don't need to remember which unit is pinned, which has already been activated, which is carrying loot, or which has suffered damage beyond a certain threshold, because the table itself tells you. In terms of game design, that's incredibly powerful because it allows rule sets to become more complex without becoming unmanageable. It keeps the game flowing, reduces disputes and helps prevent the classic, wait, did I already do that unit? You know, that moment most of us have experienced at least once. Take casualty and wound tracking as an example. These markers exist to represent damage on models or units without requiring written records. So instead of reaching for a roster sheet or trying to remember whether a vehicle is on its third or fourth damage point, you simply place a token beside it. It might be a numbered counter, a small dice, a wound dial, or even something more decorative like a blood splatter marker. Functionally, they all do the same job, which is to externalise information so it's visible to both players at all times. The downside is equally obvious though, because even a small marker sitting next to a beautifully painted miniature can draw the eye away from the model itself, especially if it's a visually loud or brightly coloured one. Status and condition markers operate in much the same way. These cover effects like pinned, stunned, suppressed, burning, poisoned, hidden or shaken. Without them, players rely heavily on memory, which is fine in very small games but becomes increasingly unreliable as complexity increases. Most of us have had that moment where someone forgets a unit is pinned and moves it normally, or where a lingering effect is simply overlooked because nothing on the table reminded either player it was still active. Tokens solve that problem cleanly, but they also add another layer of visual information to the table. And once you start stacking multiple conditions across multiple units, the battlefield begins to feel busy very quickly. Activation and turn tracking is another area where tokens have become almost standard in many modern systems. In games where units activate individually rather than moving in large formations, it's very easy to lose track of what's already acted. Activation markers, order tokens or ready states prevent that confusion by clearly showing which units are still available. Again, it's a practical solution to a real problem, but it contributes further to the growing collection of items sitting alongside your miniatures. Resource and tactical tokens add yet another layer: command points, ammunition, special abilities, faction mechanics, objective tracking, loot counters and scenario specific resources all tend to fall into this category. In 1812, for example, loot markers are not just mechanical reminders, they're part of the narrative structure of the game, representing supplies being gathered during the retreat. In situations like that, the token is doing more than just bookkeeping, it's actively reinforcing the story being told on the tabletop. Even so, the visual accumulation of these elements still contributes to the broader question of clutter versus clarity. And then beyond tokens, we have tools like measuring devices, line of sight aids, firing arcs, blast templates, movement gauges. These are slightly different because they're not usually left on the table permanently, but they still represent the same underlying principle, which is translating abstract rules into physical interactions. Very few people would want to remove these entirely because they're essential to resolving the game fairly, but they still remind us that a war game is an abstraction that requires physical aids to function smoothly. And finally, there are hidden information markers, which I think are some of the most interesting in terms of gameplay impact. These represent fog of war, elements like ambushes, minefields, concealed units, dummy positions or hidden objectives. Unlike many other tokens, these can actually enhance immersion rather than detract from it, because uncertainty is a genuine part of warfare. I may actually come back to this topic in a later video. A hidden marker behind a hedge immediately creates tension and narrative possibility in a way that open information simply can't replicate. In these cases, the marker is not just a tracking device, it becomes part of the story itself. So across all of these categories, a pattern emerges. Tokens exist because they solve problems. They reduce bookkeeping, prevent mistakes, speed up play, and allow more complex systems to function smoothly. Without them, many modern games would slow down significantly or require far more external record keeping. But at the same time, every one of those solutions introduces something else onto the table, and that something is visual noise. So this is where Grandad Says 29's comments really land, because it speaks to something that sits at the heart of historical wargaming. We're not just playing games, we're also curating a visual experience. The battlefield covered in carefully painted figures has a certain atmosphere to it, and when that atmosphere is interrupted by a scattering of tokens and markers, even useful ones, it can change how the entire scene is perceived. Instead of looking like a miniature battlefield, it can start to feel more like a board game representation of one. And yet the practical side of things is hard to ignore. Most of us would rather have a slightly busier table than a game that constantly breaks down into arguments about memory or requires repeated references to notes. There's a reason tokens have become so widespread, and it's not simply laziness or poor design. They genuinely improve playability in many systems, especially as rule sets become more nuanced and scenario driven. For me personally, I sit somewhere in the middle of this, as always, on the fence. I don't mind tokens when they're doing a job that actually improves the flow of the game, but I do think there's something worth paying attention to when they start to dominate the visual field. The question then becomes not whether we use tokens, but how we use them and how we might make them sit more comfortably within the visual language of the tabletop. Now, one of the simplest approaches, and arguably one of the most effective, is to stop thinking of tokens as separate gaming objects and start thinking them as part of the scenery. Instead of brightly coloured plastic counters, we can use markers that are designed to blend into the battlefield. Casualty markers can be represented by discarded equipment, broken weapons or scattered gear. Suppression might be shown with smoke effects or small terrain pieces. Activation states can be represented with subtle scenic elements like stones, flags or camp equipment that already feel like they're part of the environment. In some cases, players can go even further and integrate markers directly into base design or terrain pieces, turning what would normally be a token into something that feels like a natural extension of the battlefield. Even simple changes in material or colour palette can make a big difference, shifting something from game piece to part of the scene. Now, of course, there is a balance to strike here as well. Not every game group has the time or inclination to build custom scenic tokens for every mechanic, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with using straightforward markers if they do the job. But it does open up an interesting design space where visual integration becomes part of the hobby rather than an afterthought. Ultimately, I think this entire discussion comes down to priorities rather than right and wrong answers. Tokens, markers and counters exist because they make games easier to play, but they also affect how those games look on the table. Some players will always prioritise clarity and efficiency, others will prioritise visual immersion, and most of us will shift between these two depending on the game, the rule set and even the mood of the evening. What I find most interesting is that this isn't really a problem to be solved, but a balance to be explored. Every wargame sits somewhere between simulation, abstraction and spectacle, and tokens are just one of the many tools that help us navigate that space. The real question is not whether they belong, but how we choose to use them and what kind of battlefield we want to create when everything is set up on the table. Do tokens, cards and markers enhance your games by making them smoother and more reliable, or do you find they pull you out of the visual illusion that makes historical wargaming so compelling? And if you found ways to integrate them more naturally into your tabletop, I'd genuinely love to hear how you've done it. That's it for this week. Please join the chat in the comments and don't forget to like, subscribe and ring the bell for your weekly fix. Until next week, stay safe, keep gaming and of course, keep rolling high.